The Johnson family lived in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Houston, Texas, where their large, well-kept home blended seamlessly with the other suburban houses. From the outside, the family seemed to have everything: a successful career for Raymond, a loving marriage, and a son who was excelling in college. Raymond Johnson, at 38, was a man of ambition. He had worked his way up from modest beginnings to become a well-respected businessman. His career demanded long hours and significant travel, leaving little time for his family. His wife Patricia, at 36, had once been proud of her husband's accomplishments, but over the years, that pride had turned into quiet resentment. Patricia was a nurse who worked long shifts at the hospital. She was known for her compassion and dedication, traits that had made her a pillar of their family. However, the emotional distance between her and Raymond had grown insidiously. What began as a natural drift due to Raymond's career had turned into something deeper and more painful. Conversations between them were now brief, focused on logistics rather than emotions. Their once close connection had faded, replaced by an unspoken tension that neither seemed willing to address. Raymond noticed the change in his wife, though he couldn't pinpoint when exactly things had started to shift. He attributed it to the stress of work and their demanding schedules. To cope, he threw himself even more into his business, believing that financial success would make up for the emotional absence. But this only worsened the problem, leaving Patricia feeling neglected and alone. The emotional void between them widened with each passing day. It was in this emotional vacuum that Marcus, their 20-year-old son, found himself increasingly drawn to his stepmother. Patricia had married Raymond when Marcus was still young, and she had always been the nurturing figure in his life. As the tensions in the household grew, Marcus noticed Patricia's loneliness and began spending more time with her, offering the emotional support she craved but no longer received from Raymond. They would talk late into the night, at first about casual topics like his college life or her work at the hospital, but soon their conversations deepened. Patricia confided in Marcus more than she ever had with Raymond in recent years. For Marcus, what began as genuine concern for his stepmother turned into something more complex. He started to see her in a different light, no longer just the woman who had helped raise him, but someone who was vulnerable, someone he wanted to protect. His feelings for her shifted from admiration to something much deeper, though he couldn't fully understand or articulate what he was feeling. Marcus was confused by the intensity of his emotions, but instead of distancing himself, he continued to be drawn toward her. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Patricia had also begun to rely on him in ways that went beyond their typical mother-son relationship. She found comfort in his attention, which filled the emotional gap left by Raymond. While she didn't consciously recognize the growing closeness between them as inappropriate, there was a subtle shift in their dynamic that both of them seemed to ignore. Small gestures, a touch on the arm, a lingering glance, carried a weight that neither of them acknowledged. Raymond, though distracted by his work, wasn't entirely blind to what was happening. He noticed the increasing amount of time Marcus and Patricia spent together. He would come home late from the office to find them in the living room, their heads close together, talking in low voices. When he asked about it, Patricia would brush it off, explaining that Marcus had been sharing details about his college courses or just seeking advice. Raymond dismissed his concerns, attributing their closeness to the bond they had always shared. He told himself it was a natural part of family life, but something about it gnawed at him, a subtle unease that he couldn't shake. As weeks turned into months, the unspoken tension within the Johnson household continued to grow. Patricia felt increasingly trapped in her marriage, her emotional needs unmet. Raymond buried himself deeper into his work, oblivious to the extent of his wife's loneliness. And Marcus, torn between his feelings for Patricia and the knowledge that they were inappropriate, struggled with a confusion that was only intensifying. None of them could predict the disastrous consequences that would come from this unspoken storm brewing beneath the surface. The Johnson family, once held together by love and respect, was slowly unraveling, and though no one had yet crossed a physical line, the emotional boundaries were already dangerously blurred. As Raymond became more absorbed in his work, often spending long hours at the office or traveling for business, the already strained atmosphere in the Johnson household grew more tense. Patricia, left alone for most of the day, found herself increasingly isolated. She tried to focus on a nursing job, but the emotional void in her marriage gnawed at her. Raymond's absence felt like a rejection, and each time he came home late or skipped dinner, the gap between them widened. Patricia was lonely, and her frustration with Raymond's distance quietly festered. During this time, Marcus, now in his second year of college, also began spending more time at home. His classes were nearby, and he often returned between lectures to study or relax. As Patricia and Raymond grew apart, Marcus unintentionally filled the void left by his stepfather's neglect. What had once been a normal, familial bond between Patricia and Marcus began to shift into something more intimate, something neither of them consciously acknowledged at first. It started with small gestures, Patricia asking Marcus about his day more frequently, leaning on his advice for household decisions when Raymond wasn't around. Their conversations, once lighthearted and casual, began to deepen. Marcus, sensing his stepmother's loneliness, became her confidant. They shared their frustrations with life, Patricia about her strained marriage and Marcus about the pressures of college. He became her emotional anchor, offering a level of support that Raymond had long since abandoned. One evening, after yet another argument with Raymond, Patricia was visibly upset. Raymond had canceled dinner plans again, choosing instead to work late. The disappointment on her face was clear when Marcus entered the kitchen, and without asking, he sat beside her at the dining table. They talked quietly about her frustrations, about how disconnected Raymond had become. Marcus listened intently, his concern for Patricia genuine. As they continued talking, Patricia found herself laughing at some memory Marcus had shared from his childhood. It was the first time in a while that she had felt comforted, and the tension from her argument with Raymond began to lift. That night, after the conversation had carried on longer than either of them expected, they moved out to the porch, where the air was cooler, and the darkness provided a strange sense of intimacy. As they sat together, the conversation shifted from complaints about Raymond to more personal topics, things they had never really discussed before. Marcus shared his own feelings of isolation, how difficult it had been to adjust to college life without much support from his father. Patricia, in turn, spoke about her own growing sense of loneliness. The honesty between them grew, and without realizing it, they were crossing an emotional line that had previously kept their relationship grounded in the familial roles of stepmother and stepson. As the night grew later, a natural closeness developed. Patricia rested her hand on the armrest, and in a brief moment of boldness, Marcus let his hand linger over hers. It wasn't an overtly romantic gesture, but the touch carried a weight neither of them was prepared for. Patricia felt the warmth of his hand, and though part of her knew she should have pulled away, she didn't. Instead, they sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Neither of them spoke about what had just happened, but they both knew something had shifted. A boundary had been crossed. Though it was subtle, the lingering touch blurred the lines of their relationship. Patricia's initial reaction was one of confusion. She knew this was wrong, Marcus was her stepson, but in the moment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, comfort. She rationalized it as harmless, convincing herself that it was nothing more than an emotional need being met after years of neglect from Raymond. In the following days, Patricia tried to push the moment from her mind. She immersed herself in work, trying to avoid any deeper reflection on what had happened. But despite her efforts, she found herself thinking about Marcus more often. She began to look forward to their late-night talks, to his company. She ignored the growing guilt by telling herself that it was innocent, that there was nothing wrong with seeking comfort in her stepson's presence. Marcus, however, struggled more openly with his feelings. The touch had been small, but it had awakened emotions in him that he hadn't fully acknowledged before. His affection for Patricia was no longer just a bond formed from years of being raised by her. It had become something more, something he couldn't quite control. He tried to suppress these feelings, telling himself it was wrong, but the more time they spent together, the more difficult it became to maintain the boundaries. Each smile, each laugh, each casual touch between them now held a weight that it hadn't before. The dynamic in the house shifted noticeably. Raymond, oblivious to the growing emotional entanglement, remained absorbed in his work. His absence became the norm, and as the weeks passed, Marcus and Patricia continued to share moments that skirted the edges of propriety. Neither of them spoke about it openly, but the emotional connection was undeniable. What had once been a natural bond between stepmother and stepson had morphed into something deeper, more dangerous. Patricia's guilt began to surface, but she buried it, convincing herself that their relationship had always been close. She told herself that nothing had really changed, but deep down, she knew they were approaching a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Marcus, on the other hand, found himself torn between the moral boundaries he knew existed and the undeniable attraction he felt toward Patricia. The tension was building, though neither of them understood just how far they were from the breaking point. Raymond had always been an observant man, though his focus on work had dulled that side of him for some time. However, in recent weeks, a gnawing suspicion had crept into his mind. He couldn't ignore the subtle changes in his household any longer. Patricia had become distant, often distracted, and Marcus had grown more protective of her. The once easygoing conversations between them had taken on an edge that Raymond couldn't quite place, but he knew something wasn't right. His instincts, dulled by long hours at the office, had finally caught up with him, and his suspicions began to harden into something more concrete. It started with small, seemingly innocuous observations. Raymond would come home from work and find Marcus and Patricia sitting too close on the couch, their laughter a little too intimate, their body language suggesting a connection that went beyond the typical mother-son bond. At first, Raymond dismissed it, telling himself he was being paranoid. But the way Marcus subtly positioned himself between Raymond and Patricia during conversations, or how Patricia seemed to light up more in Marcus' presence than in his own, set off alarm bells in his mind. One evening, Raymond decided to come home early from work, hoping to spend some time with his family. He hadn't announced his early return, wanting to surprise them, and as he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the lights were on in the living room. Quietly, he entered the house, his footsteps light as he walked through the front door. As he approached the living room, he could hear the murmur of voices, Patricia and Marcus, engaged in what sounded like a private conversation. Raymond paused just outside the doorway, listening. At first, their conversation seemed innocent enough. Marcus was talking about something that happened at college, and Patricia was laughing softly. But then, the tone shifted. Marcus' voice lowered, becoming more serious, and Patricia responded with a quiet intensity that Raymond hadn't heard from her in a long time. The words themselves were harmless, but the underlying emotion was unmistakable: intimacy, closeness. Raymond's heart began to race as he realized that this wasn't just a casual chat between mother and son. There was something more here, something he had been blind to. He stayed in the shadows, listening as Patricia comforted Marcus, telling him how much she appreciated having him around. Marcus responded with words of affection, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion. There was no physical contact, no overt admission of feelings, but the connection between them was clear. It was the kind of emotional closeness that should have existed between husband and wife, not stepmother and stepson. Raymond felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over him. He had been so consumed by work, by trying to provide for his family, that he had missed what was happening right under his nose. His wife, the woman he had loved for years, had emotionally distanced herself from him and had found comfort in their son. Though there was no evidence of a physical affair, the emotional betrayal was enough to send him over the edge. Without thinking, Raymond stepped into the room. His sudden presence startled Patricia and Marcus, both of whom looked up in shock. Patricia's face immediately went pale, and Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his father with a mix of guilt and defiance. "What the hell is going on here?" Raymond demanded, his voice sharp and accusing. He stood in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his eyes darting between Patricia and Marcus. Patricia, still recovering from the shock of his unexpected arrival, stammered a response. "Raymond, it's not what you think. We were just talking." "Talking?" Raymond spat the word like it was poison. "I've seen the way you two have been acting. You think I haven't noticed? The looks, the whispers, the way you're always together when I'm not around? Don't insult me by pretending this is just a conversation." Patricia stood up, her face flushed with guilt and confusion. Raymond, please, you're overreacting. There's nothing going on between us. Marcus is just trying to support me. Support you? Raymond's voice rose with fury. I'm your husband. I'm the one who's supposed to support you. But you've shut me out, Patricia, and now I come home to find you, what? Confiding in him? Laughing with him? Like I don't exist? Marcus, sensing the situation was spiraling out of control, stood up as well, positioning himself protectively in front of Patricia. Dad, calm down. You're getting this all wrong. I'm just trying to help Mom through a tough time. Raymond's eyes narrowed, his anger now fully directed at his son. Help her? What are you, her husband now? You think you can just step in and take my place because I'm not around as much? Marcus clenched his jaw, his own frustration bubbling to the surface. Maybe if you were here more, she wouldn't need me to be there for her. The words hit Raymond like a punch to the gut. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Patricia looked between the two men, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never intended for this to happen, never meant for Marcus to take on the role that Raymond had neglected. But now, standing there, caught between her husband and her stepson, she realized just how far things had gone. Raymond took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. So that's it, then? You two think you can just, what? Replace me? Have your own little life while I'm out there working to keep this family afloat? Patricia shook her head desperately. No, Raymond, it's not like that. I love you, but things have been hard. You've been so distant, and Marcus was he was just there for me. There, Raymond muttered, his fists trembling with restrained anger. You've both betrayed me. Emotionally, you've abandoned me. Don't lie to me, Patricia, I see it now. You've been pushing me away for months, and he's been waiting to take my place. The confrontation grew more heated, the accusations flying back and forth. Patricia tried to calm Raymond down, insisting that nothing inappropriate had happened, but Raymond's mind was already made up. He saw the connection between them for what it was, an emotional affair, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical infidelity. Finally, unable to take any more, Raymond stormed out of the house, leaving Patricia and Marcus in stunned silence. They stood there for a long moment, neither of them knowing what to say. The truth had been exposed, and though nothing physical had happened between them, the emotional damage was undeniable. In the days following the confrontation, the Johnson household became a powder keg, ready to explode. Raymond's anger, once simmering under the surface, now consumed him entirely. He couldn't look at Patricia or Marcus without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal, real or imagined. The emotional distance that had once been subtle was now glaringly obvious. Raymond refused to engage in conversation with either of them, choosing instead to stew in silence. He began avoiding the house altogether, staying out late and returning home only when he was certain Patricia and Marcus were asleep. Patricia, equally shaken by the confrontation, tried in vain to make amends. She approached Raymond several times, attempting to explain that nothing physical had happened between her and Marcus, but Raymond's rage left no room for discussion. He shut her down with cold, stony silence, his eyes filled with a resentment that seemed to deepen with each passing day. The once warm and inviting home now felt like a war zone, every interaction loaded with tension and unspoken accusations. Marcus, for his part, was caught in the middle. He knew that his closeness with Patricia had crossed a line, though he had never intended to hurt anyone. The weight of his stepfather's accusations hung over him like a dark cloud. He spent most of his time in his room, trying to avoid Raymond's cold glares, but the guilt and confusion gnawed at him. Marcus knew the house was on the verge of something terrible, but he didn't know how to fix it. Every attempt to speak with Raymond was met with hostility, and Marcus began to feel like a stranger in his own home. It wasn't long before Raymond began drinking heavily. It started with a few glasses of whiskey after work, but soon it escalated into entire bottles consumed in one sitting. The alcohol fueled his already festering anger, giving him a sense of courage that he otherwise lacked. Each drink made his thoughts darker, more focused on the perceived betrayal. Patricia and Marcus became the objects of his fury, their presence in his life now a source of constant pain. Raymond would sit alone in the darkened living room, a half-empty bottle by his side, replaying the confrontation in his mind, each time stoking the flames of his rage. One evening, after a particularly heavy drinking session, Raymond returned home in a fit of anger. His movements were unsteady, his mind clouded by alcohol and the weight of his suspicions. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Patricia was working a late shift at the hospital, and Marcus was sitting alone in the living room, flipping through the channels on the TV, trying to distract himself from the tension that hung over the house like a dark shadow. Raymond stumbled into the living room, his eyes bloodshot and wild with fury. The sight of Marcus, sitting there as though nothing had happened, sent Raymond over the edge. He felt a surge of hatred rise in his chest, fueled by the alcohol and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had consumed him for weeks. Without a word, he crossed the room in a few shaky steps, standing over Marcus with clenched fists. "You think I don't know?" Raymond's voice was slurred, but the anger in his tone was unmistakable. "You think I'm blind, Marcus? You've been after her this whole time, haven't you?" Marcus looked up, startled by the sudden confrontation. He could see the anger in Raymond's eyes, the drunken haze that clouded his judgment. "Dad, you're drunk. You don't know what you're saying." "Don't call me that," Raymond roared, his voice echoing through the house. "You're no son of mine. You've been trying to take her from me, and you know it." Marcus stood up, raising his hands in a placating gesture, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Raymond, I'm not trying to take anyone from you. You're overreacting. Let's just calm down, okay?" But Raymond was far beyond calming down. The alcohol had unleashed all of the resentment and fury he had bottled up since discovering the emotional bond between Patricia and Marcus. His fists clenched tighter, and in a sudden burst of rage, he shoved Marcus hard in the chest. "You think I'm stupid?" Raymond shouted, advancing on Marcus. "You've been messing around with my wife, haven't you? You've been waiting for your chance, acting like you're the man of this house." Marcus stumbled back, trying to keep his balance, his heart racing. "No. That's not what's happening. You're wrong." But Raymond wasn't listening. The anger, the alcohol, and the perceived betrayal clouded his senses. He lunged at Marcus, his fists swinging wildly. Marcus, who had never fought his stepfather before, tried to defend himself, grabbing Raymond by the arms to stop the onslaught. But Raymond was too far gone, his movements erratic and unpredictable. As they grappled, the situation quickly escalated. Raymond's rage was uncontrollable, and his swings became more violent, more desperate. Marcus, trying to protect himself, pushed Raymond away, harder than he intended. Raymond, caught off balance, stumbled backward. His foot caught on the edge of the coffee table, and in one horrifying moment, he fell, his head slamming against the sharp corner of the table with a sickening crack. Time seemed to stop. Marcus froze, his hand still raised in defense, his breath caught in his throat. The room, which had been filled with the sounds of their struggle just moments before, fell into an eerie silence. Raymond lay motionless on the floor, his body limp, his head at an unnatural angle. A small pool of blood began to form around his skull, slowly seeping into the carpet. "Raymond?" Marcus' voice was barely a whisper, shaky with shock. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dad?" There was no response. Raymond's chest didn't rise, his body didn't move. The reality of what had just happened hit Marcus like a freight train. His stepfather was dead. In a matter of seconds, everything had changed. What had started as a drunken confrontation had ended in a tragedy that Marcus could never have predicted. Patricia, hearing the commotion from the driveway as she returned home from her shift, rushed into the house. She found Marcus standing over Raymond's lifeless body, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. The blood on the floor, the stillness of Raymond's body, it all told the same horrifying story. Marcus had killed his stepfather, whether it was an accident or not. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences were more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The aftermath of Raymond's death was immediate and all-consuming. The once quiet and stable home of the Johnson family became a crime scene, flooded with flashing police lights and murmurs from concerned neighbors. Patricia and Marcus stood in the front yard as the paramedics carried Raymond's lifeless body away on a stretcher. The weight of the moment, the finality of what had happened, pressed down on both of them like an unbearable burden. Patricia couldn't stop shaking, while Marcus stood frozen, his mind barely able to process what had unfolded. The police questioned both Patricia and Marcus extensively. Marcus explained, through ragged breaths and trembling hands, that it had been an accident, that he had pushed Raymond during a heated argument, and Raymond had fallen and hit his head. Patricia corroborated the story, though her voice was hollow and distant. She had been a nurse long enough to understand that nothing she could say would undo what had happened. The investigators were thorough, but in the end, the evidence supported Marcus' version of events. The fall, the blood patterns, the bruise on Raymond's head, all pointed to an accidental death. The legal system didn't hold Marcus accountable for Raymond's death. The district attorney declined to press charges, ruling it a tragic accident. But even though there would be no trial, no prison sentence, the emotional toll was far greater than any legal consequence. The community, which had once admired the Johnson family, was rocked by the news. Whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, rumors of tension in the Johnson household, of the strange closeness between Marcus and Patricia. Though no one knew the full extent of what had happened behind closed doors, the damage to their reputation was irreversible. Patricia was consumed by guilt. In the quiet days that followed, the enormity of her role in Raymond's death crushed her spirit. She replayed the events in her mind over and over, wondering how things had gone so terribly wrong. It wasn't just the fight that had led to Raymond's death that haunted her, it was everything that had come before it. She realized, painfully, that she had let her loneliness and her emotional dependence on Marcus fester to the point where it had poisoned her marriage and destroyed her family. Every glance at Marcus, every quiet moment in the house that now felt unbearably empty, was a reminder of the role she had played in unraveling their lives. Marcus, too, was grappling with the weight of his actions. Though legally exonerated, he couldn't escape the crushing reality that he had killed his stepfather. His hands had pushed Raymond, and in doing so, he had shattered the lives of everyone involved. Guilt gnawed at him, and the once warm and supportive bond he had shared with Patricia now felt suffocating. He couldn't look at her without remembering the fight, the anger in Raymond's eyes, the sickening sound of his head hitting the table. Their relationship, once a source of comfort, had become tainted by the tragedy. He withdrew from her emotionally, consumed by the belief that he had destroyed his family. The neighborhood, too, was never the same. While no one in the community knew the intimate details of what had transpired, the whispers and gossip lingered long after the incident. Neighbors speculated about the family's dynamic, curious as to what could have driven Raymond to such a violent confrontation with his son. People avoided eye contact with Patricia and Marcus at the grocery store or when passing them on the street, their once friendly faces now marked by quiet judgment or discomfort. Patricia, unable to cope with the constant reminders of Raymond's death, eventually made the decision to leave Houston. The house was filled with too many memories, too much pain. Each room echoed with the ghosts of the past, and she couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. She packed up her belongings, leaving behind the life she had built with Raymond, and moved to a smaller town where no one knew her, where she could try to escape the whispers and the guilt that clung to her. But even in her new life, she found no peace. The guilt followed her, a shadow she couldn't outrun. Marcus, still devastated by the tragedy, dropped out of college. The academic future he had once been so proud of now felt meaningless in the wake of what had happened. His focus was shattered, his mind constantly drifting back to that night. He distanced himself from his old life, from his friends, and even from Patricia. The once close relationship they had shared was irreparably damaged, a painful reminder of the consequences of their unspoken emotions. Marcus moved to a new city, hoping that distance would somehow help him rebuild his life, but the weight of Raymond's death remained with him, a constant, inescapable burden. The Johnson family, once united by love and ambition, had been torn apart by hidden desires and unspoken tensions. What had begun as emotional distance had spiraled into a tragedy that left nothing but heartbreak and regret in its wake. The family home, once filled with laughter and warmth, now stood empty, a monument to the destruction that had unfolded within its walls. In the end, the story of the Johnson family became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how unspoken emotions and unresolved tensions can fester beneath the surface, leading to devastating consequences. What they had lost was far more than just a loved one. It was their future, their happiness, and their sense of who they were as a family. All that remained was the wreckage, the pieces of a life they could never put back together.